Picture this. A cocky dojo master, dripping with confidence, laughing in the face of a quiet janitor who's just trying to do his job. The room's buzzing with students, all waiting for the master to show off his skills. But what happens when the janitor steps onto the mat, broom in hand, and accepts the challenge? You won't believe how this underdog flips the script in a way that leaves everyone speechless. Stick around, because this is a story of grit, skill, and a jaw-dropping twist that'll make you rethink judging a book by its cover. The dojo was alive with the hum of anticipation, a cavernous space filled with the scent of polished wood and sweat-soaked gi. At the center stood Sensei Hiroshi, a third-degree black belt whose reputation preceded him like a storm cloud. His students, a mix of wide-eyed beginners and seasoned fighters, gathered in a loose circle, their whispers buzzing like bees. Hiroshi was in his element, his sharp eyes scanning the room for a sparring partner to demonstrate his latest kata. His gaze landed on Marcus, the janitor, a wiry man in his late 30s with a mop of dark hair and a quiet demeanor that made him blend into the background. Marcus was sweeping near the edge of the mat, his movements deliberate, almost meditative. Hiroshi, with a smirk curling his lips, decided to make a spectacle. "Hey, janitor," he called, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Think you can handle a real fighter?" The students snickered, their laughter a low rumble that echoed off the dojo walls. Marcus paused, his broom still in hand, and looked up with calm, unreadable eyes. He didn't respond at first, just set the broom against the wall and stepped forward, his worn sneakers silent on the mat. The crowd's laughter grew louder, a chorus of disbelief, as Hiroshi gestured for Marcus to join him. "Let's see what the cleaning guy's got," Hiroshi taunted, cracking his knuckles. Marcus, unfazed, tied a borrowed white belt around his waist, his movements slow but precise like a man who'd done this before. The students exchanged glances, some rolling their eyes, others leaning forward, curious despite themselves. Hiroshi, towering over Marcus, began circling him, his stance low and aggressive, a predator toying with prey. But there was something about Marcus's quiet confidence, the way his shoulders stayed relaxed, his feet planted just so, that made a few in the crowd pause. The air grew thick with tension as Hiroshi lunged, throwing a swift jab aimed at Marcus's chest, expecting an easy dodge or a clumsy block. Instead, Marcus sidestepped with a fluid grace that seemed almost accidental, his body swaying like a reed in the wind. The punch missed by inches, and Hiroshi's smirk faltered just for a split second. The crowd hushed, sensing something unexpected. Marcus didn't counterattack, just reset his stance, his eyes locked on Hiroshi's, steady and unyielding. The dojo master laughed it off, louder this time, but there was a nervous edge to it now, a crack in his bravado. He threw a series of kicks, each one faster, sharper, meant to overwhelm. Marcus moved again, his deflections minimal, almost effortless, his hands guiding Hiroshi's strikes away like water redirecting a stream. The students' murmurs grew quieter, their eyes widening as they watched the janitor hold his own against a man who'd trained for decades. Hiroshi's face reddened, his movements growing more aggressive, but Marcus remained a calm center in the storm, his every step deliberate, his every block precise. By the end of the first exchange, the room was no longer laughing. A few students leaned closer, their phones forgotten, their attention glued to the mat. Marcus hadn't thrown a single punch, yet he'd already shifted the dynamic, turning the dojo master's confidence into something brittle, something that could break. Hiroshi's frustration was palpable now, a heat radiating from him as he circled Marcus again, his breaths coming sharper, his eyes narrowing. The janitor, by contrast, seemed almost serene, his face betraying no hint of strain, his body loose but ready. The students, once jeering, were now a mix of confused and intrigued, their whispers speculating about who this unassuming man really was. Hiroshi, sensing the shift in the room, decided to escalate. "Enough playing!" he growled, launching into a flurry of strikes, a spinning heel kick followed by a rapid combination of punches, each one designed to overwhelm an opponent's defenses. The crowd gasped as the attacks came, expecting Marcus to crumble under the onslaught. But Marcus moved like a shadow, his body weaving through the strikes with an economy of motion that was almost hypnotic. He didn't just dodge. He anticipated, his feet shifting just enough to avoid each blow, his hands redirecting Hiroshi's force with subtle, practiced ease. The dojo master's kicks sliced through the air, but they found only empty space, Marcus always a half step ahead. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Is he trained?" And others nodded, their skepticism giving way to curiosity. Hiroshi, now visibly rattled, shouted, "Fight back, Janitor!" But Marcus only tilted his head, his expression unreadable as if weighing whether to engage. Then, in a moment, that seemed to freeze time, Hiroshi overcommitted, his roundhouse kick sailing high, leaving his side exposed. Marcus, for the first time, acted. His hand shot out not to strike, but to tap Hiroshi's wrist, redirecting the kick's momentum and sending the dojo master stumbling forward. The crowd erupted in gasps, a few students clapping before catching themselves. Hiroshi caught his balance, spinning around with a glare that could have melted steel, but Marcus was already back in his stance, calm as ever. The janitor's restraint was maddening, a silent challenge that Hiroshi couldn't ignore. He charged again, this time with a ferocity that bordered on reckless, his fists and feet a blur. Marcus met each attack with the same quiet precision, his blocks soft but unyielding, his movements flowing like water around stone. The students began to notice the details, the way Marcus's feet barely left the ground, the way his hands moved only as much as needed, the way his eyes never left Hiroshi's. It was as if he was reading the dojo master like an open book, predicting every move before it happened. By now the crowd was split, some still rooted for Hiroshi, their loyalty to the sensei unwavering, but others were openly cheering for Marcus, drawn to the mystery of this unassuming man who moved like a master. Hiroshi's breaths were ragged. Now, his confidence eroding with every missed strike. Marcus, meanwhile, hadn't broken a sweat, his face still calm, his eyes still locked on his opponent. The room felt electric, the tension building to a breaking point as the students realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Hiroshi, desperate to reclaim control, shouted for Marcus to stop dodging and fight, but the janitor's silence was louder than any taunt, a quiet defiance that spoke volumes. The dojo was no longer a place of laughter or bravado. It was a crucible, the air thick with the weight of what was unfolding. Hiroshi, his face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment, was losing the crowd, and he knew it. His students, once his unwavering supporters, were now whispering among themselves, their eyes darting between their sensei and the janitor who refused to be broken. Marcus, still in his borrowed white belt, stood at the center of the mat, his posture relaxed but his presence commanding. Hiroshi, desperate to reassert his dominance, decided to change tactics. He slowed his pace, adopting a more calculated approach, his eyes studying Marcus for any weakness. "You're good at running," he sneered, "but let's see how you handle this." He feinted a low kick, then snapped a high one toward Marcus's head, a move that had felled many opponents in the past. The crowd held its breath, expecting the janitor to finally falter. But Marcus's response was almost otherworldly. He leaned back just enough, the kick grazing his chin, then countered with a swift, open-handed block that redirected Hiroshi's leg, throwing him off balance again. The move was so subtle, so precise, that it looked effortless, but the students knew better. A few clapped, unable to contain their awe, while others exchanged wide-eyed looks. Hiroshi, now panting, roared in frustration and launched into a new combination, a brutal series of punches aimed at Marcus's torso. The janitor met each one with a block, his forearms absorbing the blows with a softness that seemed to sap. Hiroshi's strength. Then, in a flash, Marcus shifted his weight, stepping inside Hiroshi's guard and delivering a single, controlled push to the dojo master's chest. It wasn't a strike, not really, but it sent Hiroshi staggering back, his arms flailing for balance. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others gasping, as Hiroshi caught himself against the wall. Marcus didn't pursue, didn't gloat. He simply returned to his stance, his eyes still calm, still unreadable. The students were now openly divided, some shouting encouragement to Hiroshi, others chanting Marcus's name, a name they'd barely known an hour ago. Hiroshi, his pride wounded, pushed off the wall and charged again, his attacks wilder, less controlled. Marcus met each one with the same quiet efficiency, his movements a study in minimalism, his deflections turning Hiroshi's strength against him. The dojo master's frustration was now a tangible thing, his breaths coming in gasps, his strikes growing sloppy. Marcus, by contrast, seemed untouched, his energy boundless, his focus razor-sharp. The students began to whisper about his past. Had he trained before? Was he some kind of hidden master? The speculation grew louder, fueling the tension in the room. Hiroshi, sensing he was losing more than just the fight, shouted for Marcus to stop holding back. For the first time, Marcus spoke, his voice low but clear. "I'm not here to prove anything." The words hung in the air, a quiet rebuke that hit harder than any punch. The crowd fell silent, the weight of Marcus's restraint sinking in. Hiroshi, enraged, threw everything he had into one final combination, a desperate bid to reclaim his pride. The fight was reaching its climax. The dojo a cauldron of raw emotion. Hiroshi, his GI damp with sweat, his face a mask of fury, was no longer fighting Marcus. He was fighting his own ego, his own crumbling reputation. The students, now fully invested, leaned forward, their phones raised to capture every moment. Marcus, still the eye of the storm, moved with the same unshakable calm, his blocks and dodges a masterclass in control. Hiroshi's attacks were relentless, a barrage of kicks and punches that would have overwhelmed most opponents. But Marcus was untouchable, his movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. The crowd was on edge, sensing the fight was building to something definitive. Hiroshi, his energy flagging, tried one last gambit, a spinning back fist meant to catch Marcus off guard. The janitor saw it coming, his body swaying just enough to avoid the strike, then countered with a move so subtle it was almost invisible. A light tap to Hiroshi's elbow, redirecting the dojo master's momentum and sending him spinning into an awkward stumble. The crowd exploded, cheers and gasps mingling as Hiroshi caught himself, his face burning with humiliation. Marcus didn't press the advantage, didn't need to. His point was made. Hiroshi, panting heavily, stood upright, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with a mix of anger and disbelief. The students were now openly cheering for Marcus, their loyalty to their sensei fractured by the janitor's undeniable skill. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Who is this guy?" And the question rippled through the room, unanswered, but burning. Hiroshi, desperate to end it, charged one last time, his fist aimed at Marcus's face in a final act of defiance. Marcus caught the punch, not with force, but with a gentle twist of his wrist, redirecting Hiroshi's arm and stepping aside as the dojo master stumbled forward, nearly falling. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment sinking in. Marcus stepped back, untied the white belt, and let it fall to the mat, his eyes never leaving Hiroshi's. The dojo master, exhausted and defeated, stared back, his bravado gone, replaced by something like respect, or maybe fear. Marcus turned to leave, picking up his broom as if nothing had happened, but the crowd parted for him, their whispers now a chorus of awe. A few students tried to ask him questions. Where had he trained? Why was he here? But Marcus only smiled faintly and kept walking, his silence louder than any answer. The dojo was left in stunned silence, the students grappling with what they'd just seen, their perception of strength and skill forever altered. Hiroshi, still catching his breath, watched Marcus disappear through the door, his own pride a casualty of the fight he'd started. As the dojo doors swung shut behind Marcus, the room remained frozen, the students processing the impossible. The janitor, a man they'd barely noticed before, had dismantled their sensei's ego with nothing but skill and restraint. Hiroshi stood alone on the mat, his GI disheveled, his face a mix of exhaustion and introspection. The students, still, buzzing with adrenaline, began talking over each other, piecing together what they'd witnessed. Some speculated Marcus was a former champion, hiding in plain sight. Others thought he'd learned from some secret master, his skills honed in shadows. A few rushed to their phones, posting clips of the fight online, the footage already going viral before the night was over. The dojo, once a place of rigid hierarchy, felt different now, the air charged with a new kind of respect, not for titles or belts, but for the quiet strength that Marcus embodied. Hiroshi, for his part, said nothing, his silence a stark contrast to his earlier bravado. He picked up the white belt Marcus had left behind, turning it over in his hands as if it held some answer. The students watched him, waiting for a reaction, but he only shook his head and walked to the edge of the mat, his shoulders slumped. Outside, Marcus returned to his work, sweeping the hallway with the same steady rhythm, as if the fight had been just another task. But the story didn't end there. Word of the janitor's victory spread, drawing curious fighters to the dojo, hoping to challenge the mysterious man who'd humbled a master. Marcus, however, was nowhere to be found. The next day, his shifts covered by someone else, his absence fueling the legend. The students began to see him everywhere, in every quiet worker, every unassuming stranger, wondering who else might be hiding extraordinary skill behind a humble facade. The dojo itself changed, too. Hiroshi's classes took on a new tone, his lessons now emphasizing humility, respect, and the idea that strength could come from unexpected places. The viral video sparked debates online, with some calling Marcus a modern-day samurai, others a fluke who got lucky. But those who'd been there knew the truth. Marcus hadn't just won a fight, he'd rewritten the rules of what it meant to be a warrior. As the days passed, the dojo became a pilgrimage site for those seeking to learn from the janitor's example, a reminder that true mastery wasn't in the belts or the titles, but in the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to prove themselves to anyone.